I'm going to introduce the next panel with a few brief comments. But before I do that, I just wanted to note we're going to have these breakout sessions, and people have been randomly assigned to breakout session. If you do not have one of these cards, would you kindly raise your hand so that the National Academy staff can bring you one? For online, you don't need a card. Okay. All right. Okay, very good. So one hope for this workshop is to identify the broad contours of a research agenda. That's what we're aiming for, ideally. The next fairly short panel discussion is stage for this afternoon's breakout session. And I think we've got some fantastic people lined up to give us some ideas to move forward with. I will introduce each of our speakers briefly and then let them share their prepared remarks. And then after that, open the Q&A. And so just like before on Slido, please make sure you're adding your thoughts. So Ruth Richards, could you kindly come up? She is Executive Director of the Accelerator for Systemic Risk Assessment. Catherine Mock is presumably online, professor of the Rosenstiel School of Marine, Atmospheric, and Earth Science. Esteban Rossi Hansford, Glenn A. Lloyd, Distinguished Service Professor, and Kenneth C. Griffith Department of Economics at the University of Chicago. Brian O'Neill, Earth Scientist and Laboratory Fellow at Pacific Northwest National Laboratory, although I learned today, not in the Pacific Northwest, but rather on the East Coast. And Tony Smith, Chair of the Economics Department at Yale University. And my co-moderator, Palmina, would you kindly come up? And, oh, you should have, okay, good. And I will invite Ruth Richards to come and share her remarks.
Okay, so at lunch, I madly ran down to try to integrate everything I've heard over the last day and a half. So I've got it here on my computer. So we were asked to summarize what we heard about future directions. I've been listening intently, and I'm going to keep it quite high level based on where I'm coming from. As mentioned, I'm the Executive Director of ASPRO, which stands for the Accelerator for Systemic Risk Assessment. We are a brand new and unique initiative set up to catalyze the field and the practice of systemic risk analysis. We are, in our mission statement, radically rethinking risk as a way to accelerate transformative action that protects the Earth's ecological systems and humanity from the threats of escalating systemic risks. We do that through a collaborative, transdisciplinary, very diverse network around the world. And I'm thrilled to learn from you because one of the things we'll be focusing on is a state of the practice report that will highlight the capabilities and the capacities we need to respond to systemic risk, slated to come out alongside the Secretary General of the United Nations Summit of the Future in New York in September of 2024. So to the question, perspectives on research. I've heard 5 things over the last day and a half. First, we need to create and support the processes, the platforms and networks that are systemic and transdisciplinary. And we know that we are still way too siloed. We need to accelerate the research that is bravely diving into and modeling more complex understandings of the interconnected risk cascading impacts, tipping points, and feedback loops across risk domains from technology to climate to health, peace and security, migration, poverty, biodiversity. They are all connected. And while this workshop has been fantastic, I think we need to challenge ourselves to go beyond climate and macroeconomics and delve even more into the transdisciplinary. Second, I'm going to go out on a limb here to express my second point this way. We need to bring more compassion to the research agenda and expand the scope of the science and evidence we rely on. What does this mean? Well, I think it means we need to embrace sort of polyepistemologies and incorporate the insights of diverse knowledge holders. And as someone said yesterday, we need to understand more fundamentally the difficult questions about equity, justice, and distribution, and aim for multidimensional outcomes and goals to look at lives and livelihoods disrupted, as well as human and non-human impacts. Third, I've heard a lot of people talk about focusing more on the transformative. But this, of course, means different things to different people. But I think it could include such things as really questioning obsolete mental models, like we heard from the gentleman who spoke about infrastructure yesterday, or moving beyond the perspective of the status quo to rethink more fundamentally the systems we are upholding. So for instance, we talk about our dependence on maize, rice, and soy, and the vulnerability of a food system that relies on 3 staple crops. It's kind of fundamental question I think we need to get to. Fourth, we need to embrace uncertainty. There's been a lot of talk about uncertainty and modeling, but beyond that, how do we embrace uncertainty in our actions, in our responses, in our policy and decision-making, in who we elect as leaders? Somebody said yesterday, how do people that know they don't know act? Well, this is a huge question around a false sense of predictability, control, scientific determinism, when in truth, we need to be humble in the acknowledgement that there is much we don't know or can't know, and what that means for our research and associated solution pathways. Number 5, to cheat, I created a final kind of grab all bucket to stay within my time limit. So additional needs and ways forward. We've talked about new institutions, structures, and processes, such as doing away with the legacy of bureaucratic structures and processes that are inimical to future resilience, creating policy in new ways, allowing people to enact strategies that they determine will help them reduce risks, co-development, and so on. We need new data and access to data. So much data is either proprietary in the private sector or sequestered in the public sector, especially the data on systemic risk that comes out of insurance companies, out of militaries. How do we access that data, or how do we create data that would be similar? We need transparency and open access. I heard this from a number of folks, learning and sharing. That goes all the way from data to methodologies, even to the implicit assumptions underlying our models and our analysis. We need to build the capacities and the capabilities researchers need in order to present, translate, and frame their work so that it more effectively shapes public discourse. I think this is really important, how to create connections between the research you're doing and how to get it out in the world and influencing decisions. And of course, funding that supports all of the above, that steps outside of silos and gives priority to holistic, systemic, transdisciplinary research and the organizations that support these approaches. I come from the philanthropic sector. I've seen this my entire life. And like every other institution, they tend to be quite silos. How do we bust out of that and encourage funding that really does support the transdisciplinarity that's needed? So all these things are things that ASTRA really aspires to do as an organization. And I am absolutely thrilled to find other like-minded people and professionals out there who are trying to do the same thing. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Could you kindly bring up Catherine Mock and allow her? There, thank you.
Perfect. Thank you.
Oh, you are still muted. 1 moment.
I'm still muted. Interesting. You can't hear me.
Now we can hear you. Thank you very much. Go ahead.
Sound is okay. Perfect. Wonderful. Well, I've been listening to the riveting presentations and discussions over the last 2 days, really from the vantage point of having just finished up the complex systems assessment for the National Climate Assessment, working with an utterly dynamo set of colleagues. And, I think what we in that process kept coming back to is when we think about all of these cascading, compounding interactions, multi-sector dynamics, is our science adequately confronting the complexity of climate change? And I'll just give one example, because I feel like what we've said again and again is start from the vantage point of decision making. So let's imagine a low wealth rural town. It's experiencing repeated disasters, droughts, wildfires, floods. And when they're repeating, they get worse in combination. That is a town that maybe has limited staff, limited training to really think through what evidence is available to inform their decisions. And the options available to them are going to be a function of a whole bunch of things coming into combination. The need to maintain their local tax base, availability of insurance that is shrinking, resident preferences that may be shifting wildly after these disasters are occurring and accumulating, legal risk from government declines. Okay, a next disaster happens. Should this town rebuild more resiliently in the same place, which will require a lot of money it may not have, or should it do something radically new, like merge with another local government and relocate? And what we've really asked ourselves is our science meeting this challenge? How will this town's choices affect others? How might their options change under different economic circumstances or availability of federal aid? And so in that spirit of are we doing enough to actionably confront the needs of decision-making? I'll offer 3 priorities for research into the future, and these completely overlap with Ruth's great list just now. So number 1, the real need to integrate disciplines to understand the full range of what is happening in a changing climate. It's really easy to say in our modeling, in our science, here's what the experience is likely to be for the quote unquote median household that in reality barely exists if you look at everyone living in a region. To understand which people are experiencing disproportionate burdens, to understand just how wide-ranging the effects can be of our climate responses themselves. So this really calls on us to recognize that we are often studying a few people in a few places when it comes to climate impacts and responses. We know a lot about major metropolitan areas, much less about those lower wealth communities throughout the US and globally experiencing increasing burdens of climate change. It also requires recognizing that social systems and services play different roles for different people, and we hardly are bringing that into our vantage point of complexity in a lot of the modeling that we do right now. And also recognizing that our best efforts to respond to the climate challenge themselves have very wide-ranging distributions of outcomes. So that's number 1, integrating disciplines to really understand intersectionality and the range of experiences in a changing climate from climate impacts and responses. Number 2, and this really reverberates with the themes we just heard, is thinking about the importance of collaborations across diverse knowledge holders to really improve responses and better encompass those types of complexities we've been walking through. So how are we pursuing more collaborative processes of knowledge production where not in every single research endeavor, but across the entire enterprise of knowledge creation, we need to do better in understanding the full range of perspectives, expertise, and experiences. And that we need to tap very deliberately boundary organizations that know how to do this well, know how to create those boundary objects that sit between research and practice. So that's number 2, collaborations among diverse knowledge holders. Number 3 is really recognizing that the space of governance is evolving intensively when it comes to climate change complexity. And I think as we heard really profoundly this morning and yesterday as well, increasing complexity isn't always necessarily a good thing in terms of effectiveness. So when we think about climate responses, there are more actors, organizations, institutions, laws, policies, financial mechanisms. And often for all of these experiments that are emerging, we don't know that much right now about how effectively they are actually reducing risks. Sometimes we know a lot about reducing emissions of greenhouse gases, but risk in total, much harder ballgame. So that often means that this space of collaboration across knowledge holders has to deliberately grapple with these different approaches emerging in the space of governance and really recognize that there must be institutional learning and transformation through time. And that if we're not monitoring and evaluating and doing research alongside of these governance transformations, we're not going to get to that flexible, inclusive series of adjustments that will be needed through time. And I'll just conclude by saying that to get to these themes of interdisciplinarity towards intersectionality, collaboration across diverse knowledge holders, and experiments in the space of governance, we do need to rethink our research structures and practices to more deeply support transdisciplinary coordination of research and practice. We see a lot of ways that that is emerging right now, but also a lot of ways where it's failing to deliver the returns that may be possible. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we're seeing some emerging themes here. Esteban Rossi. I'm sorry, I have to change glasses. I'm so sorry. Esteban Rossi Hansberg. Can you please bring him up?
Hello, thanks for having me. Can you hear me?
Yes, we hear you fine.
Okay, so I'm an economist, and so let me try to give a little bit of my perspective on what's missing and kind of important directions in terms of developing our methodologies and our way of thinking about the impact of climate change in the economy. And in particular, I want to focus on the reality that climate change is going to have very heterogeneous impacts across locations in space, and therefore then kind of the spatial adaptation of the economy to these climate impacts is going to be essential. But that is modeling that and thinking about what the implications of that will be for economic outcomes is it's a hard thing to do. And as economists, we are, starting to create structures to be able to do that in a more systematic way. But it's complicated, and there's a lot of methodology that needs to be developed in order to do that better. And so, ideally, what we want is models of the distribution of economic activity over time, where there's individuals and firms that are making forward-looking decisions about, what to produce, where to locate, how much to save and consume, how much to invest over time, and that take into account this potential impact of climate change and react to that. Now, the problem is that modeling that system and the complexity of that system in space is hard, and we, like I said, we don't have these frameworks to do that, and that can incorporate this kind of complex state space and the dynamics in this state space. And so in moving forward and trying to develop our understanding of the impact of climate change on the economy, it's very important to invest in the construction of this type of models. And importantly, we want models that we can solve in a practical way and solve quickly, so that we can incorporate also the richness of all the different climate impacts that have been discussed here during the last 2 days. And so right now we're at a stage where we can incorporate some of the basic effects, but certainly not all that richness. And so developing these structures again, and our capacity to compute them in quickly is essential. And this quick computation is also important because we want to incorporate, the large heterogeneity, and we want these models to be global. And so that implies that we're going to have to incorporate many different types of agents in very large numbers of locations. And we just currently don't know how to do that quickly enough, so that we can use those structures to estimate the relevant elasticities, how people are really reacting to these shocks, and the relevant frictions that they face in, for example, changing location, migrating, or changing the location of where they are producing, investing in different places, and getting those elasticities right, and in particular, those elasticities for the climate shocks specifically that we're talking about, is essential. And then the final point I want to make is, then we want, of course, then to use these frameworks to think about, anticipation, what people know about what the future will bring, and we need to use these frameworks to think about risk and how they're going to react to the fact that both there's risk about what they don't know, but there's also risk that it's inherent in the forecast that we understand. And so incorporating that risk again it involves these large systems that we are not capable of handling at the moment in a practical way. And so again, we need to invest in this dimension. If we don't invest in this dimension, we're going to stay with structures that are just not up to the task of really understanding the phenomenon at the granular level that we need to understand it in order for it to be practical for policy and for the type of investments that we need to make in order to prevent the worst effects from climate change. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That lays out a challenging goal for research funding. Can I invite Brian O'Neill to share some remarks? Would you like to do it from there or up here? Sure. All right.
This need to be turned on.
I think so. Yeah, it should be glowing green.
Okay, thanks. So I'm going to offer a few thoughts or reflections on future research directions that aren't exactly summaries of what we've heard, but are informed in various ways by the last couple days. And I have three of those to share. So one is, I don't know if this was a shared experience, but I found in several of our conversations about cascading or compounding risks that it wasn't quite clear what we were talking about, what kinds of risks that actually described, both, in a temporal sense or spatially, or what kind of sectors, or how big they were. The conversation sometimes went toward collapse, right? So we're talking about impacts that could lead to collapse, and maybe that's the idea, but I wasn't quite sure. So one thing that may be useful is, this is a low-tech suggestion, is to come up with a list of just qualitative descriptions, vignettes, something of the kinds of cascading risks that we have in mind that could potentially take place, right? This could be an interdisciplinary exercise that draws on different disciplines of cascading from one part of society or economy to another. And then we'd have a better basis for saying, okay, are these things that our models can or could anyway represent, or are we, is it going to be kind of a lost cause to try to model these with our current tools, and we need a different approach altogether? So that's one suggestion. A second one is that I know there was a mitigation breakout group yesterday, but in general, I feel like, this meeting, for good reason, was structured in a way to think about physical risks, right, as opposed to transition risks. I think it's important, especially if we're looking for big impacts, ways that impacts could be big, is to think about these occurring together at the same time. So what do impacts look like in an economy or a society that is trying to go through a major transition in the energy system, which, we hope will go smoothly, but for such a large and potentially rapid change, there's likely to be things going not as well as we would think they might. So if we're thinking about the potential effects of heat waves, can we think about those maybe in an energy system that has high prices potentially, that may have some intermittency issues as renewable shares go up and maybe storage isn't quite keeping pace? There are interactions as well in the food system if we're having agricultural impacts in a situation where there's competition for land to be growing biomass, to supply a low carbon source of energy during the transition. So I think, and there is some work on this, you know, I think this is another, just as a side note, a message that a lot of these things that we've talked about, there is some work on it. It's not like no one has thought of this stuff before, but it's not the you know, mainstream standard way of looking at things, where we still tend to divide these up into let's talk about impacts and then separately let's talk about mitigation. Last are some modeling improvements that, you know, we can, I'm sure people have long lists in mind of ways that models could be improved. I will mention two that I think, with building from the discussion that went on day one, on where there was a lot of mention of understanding the drivers of vulnerability and future adaptive capacity, and the lack of inclusion of some of that in, for example, the heat mortality literature and other areas, is that in order to facilitate representing vulnerable populations, we need to be able to, in our large scale modeling, distinguish subpopulations from each other, the vulnerable from the less vulnerable. And so introducing this kind of heterogeneity in large scale integrated assessment, impact modeling, as a matter of course, I think will be increasingly important if we want to be able to capture the potential severity of impacts. And to end with one other modeling suggestion, it's one that we know and love, is the suggestion to try to make some more progress on introducing extreme events and responses to them in, again, I'm speaking from this perspective of large scale modeling, where there is some work. There's starting to be some work in agricultural modeling on modeling response to extremes within these large scale global modeling, but there's not much of it. And since we suspect, I think, when we're talking about cascading and compounding impacts, that we're often talking about impacts related to extreme events, this will be especially important. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I'm going to take just a moment to acknowledge that this is in the room. And I'm going to probably make a hash of it, say collapse can be thought of as rapid simplification of complex systems. So if you're taking an approach that looks at complex systems and that's what you're analyzing, collapse can be part of your analysis. It doesn't have to be an anatomy. And I hope I didn't get that too far. So Tony Smith, please.
Thank you very much. Can everyone hear me all right? So I am a macroeconomist, and to be honest, I work in modeling approaches quite similar to what Esteban is doing. So I kind of, maybe we didn't get enough heterogeneity on the panel, because we're kind of similar in our perspectives. Echo, I think he expressed in an articulate way some of the things I also care about as a macroeconomist. So let me just provide a little perspective, having listened today. So I think, just to back up a little bit, what I'm trying to do as a macroeconomist is build a laboratory for studying heterogeneous impacts of climate change around the globe into the future, and heterogeneous responses or impacts of different kinds of policies that might be enacted around the globe to combat climate change. So we're looking for a fully articulated model that's dynamic, is quantitative. It's detailed in space, because I agree with Esteban that the spatial impacts can be quite important. And then it incorporates a theory of behavior of agents, firms, and consumers. Again, Esteban noted that as well. So it's a completely articulated model, calibrated to match certain data that you can then use to ask questions about what might happen in the future as the climate changes. And it's key that it be a general equilibrium system, which means to economists that you allow the full response of agents, of consumers and firms to changes, to policy. They can move different places, the prices and wages can change. That would lead then to endogenous responses as a way of adapting to these changes. And again, it's critical that I have the space and time. I think Esteban's work, my work, and many of the work of people in the room noted that there's a large heterogeneity and impacts across space. So it's quite critical to incorporate that feature. So I've actually been working myself with two climate scientists in Norway who know how to run the Norwegian Earth system model. And so my latest project, still ongoing, is to integrate the Norwegian Earth system model with an earlier version of the spatial general equilibrium model I've been working on. And it's precisely to try and bring in extreme events, as Brian was just saying. So I think it's quite important that that these general equilibrium dynamic macro models incorporate weather as well as climate. So it's not just the average. I don't have to speak. I'm speaking to the choir here, but so that's just the average temperature that matters. Maybe it's extreme events that matter. And so it's weather draws from a climate distribution as the climate distribution is shifting that matters. So I think it's quite important to incorporate that. And that's a difficult thing to do. I'll come back to that in a second. I also want to make a connection to Stephanie Fried's talk on aggregate versus idiosyncratic risk. So maybe an aggregate effect of climate change, maybe it's not that large potentially, but in different locations, it can be extremely large, right? So impacting locations differently. That's why space matters. So I think it's quite important to get together climate scientists with economists. I spent a couple of years trying to develop a language so we can talk to each other and understand and run our models back and forth. They'll run the Earth system model, I'll feed it into my model, and go back and forth. We're working on that. Models like this that have weather and risk can also let us address questions about risk sharing, which you need a model for. So the model can address, maybe there's a way for regions or the United Nations at the global level to shift resources around in response to climate shocks. I think it's a very important adaptation response. Now, also, I'm a little bit on the defense of an economist. Seems like economists get short shrift sometimes in different audiences outside of my usual realm of macroeconomics. So I think there's a concern maybe that we're not, we don't have realistic models of human behavior. And maybe they are oversimplified. So I think in addition to collaboration between climate scientists and economists, and it's super important, I think it's also important that maybe talk to some of the anthropologists or the sociologists. We bring our models of behavior to some other social scientists, kind of ask, what is it about this that you don't like? Economists like it for this reason. What do you think is missing here? Maybe we can improve. And that'll help communicate what economists are doing to the broader audience if the theory of behavior is more plausible. So in terms of, directly from my own research, it'd be super nice to have more funding on computation. I think Esteban made the same point. Both software and hardware, lots of heterogeneous actors, you need parallel processing, lots of software needs to be written to implement new kinds of methods. There's issues of how you integrate timescales. The economic models operate on a 1-year time scale. The Earth system model runs incredibly at a half-hour time scale. How do you merge those two? How do you being nonlinear chaotic dynamics, which drive these Earth system models into an economic model, which is normally thinks about things as random shocks. So how do you do that integration? There are ways of doing that, but I think it's a challenging research question. And be great to have super and many people have said this, it'd be great to have way more detailed data on damages at a high degree of resolution. I think damages is where the economics literature is probably the weakest. And then finally, going along with the complexity point, I'll note that a paper on the climate effects on mortality had 25 co-authors in the quarterly Journal of Economics. So I don't know how I can compete with that, just my very small team, but I think that, but the point is that we need teams of researchers working together. We need funding for more of these teams. The Climate Impact Lab, where that particular paper came from, is a great group, and we can have other groups that are, and I know there's some represented here, but more funding that brings together different kinds of people and lets them achieve more in a coordinated way and be super, super valuable here. All right, that's it.
Thank you very much. It sounds like you're trying to do what we're saying needs to be done. So this is terrific. We're now going to take some questions. We're going to go a little bit longer. This was going to end at 2, but we're going to go to 2:10. And Helena, grab a mic. Yours is, yeah, is that green? Good.
Okay, I'm gonna start on with the questions that have risen to the top. So I think this one is for everyone. Could a national socioeconomic plus climate scenario development process serve as a boundary object or point of integration for transdisciplinary collaboration, including systemic thinking about elements that we cannot yet effectively measure or monitor? I think it's for everyone.
You might have to say that again.
Okay.
There's a lot in there.
Okay. Could a national socioeconomic plus climate scenario development process serve as a boundary object or a point of integration for transdisciplinary collaboration? I'm gonna stop it there.
I'd love to jump in on this one. Am I on right now? Yep. Okay, my answer would be yes. And I think a place where I've been thinking about this a lot is, here in Florida, as is increasingly the case across the country, there are tremendous questions around risk management mechanisms such as insurance. And I think what we all know for sure is that there is a lot to be learned from history, but there are real limits to that. So for example, what we've been doing is saying empirically, we can look back to the past of how insurance has fared in this state to date, or we could also recognize that there are limits to that, and we can really combine the socioeconomics and the climate into possible evolutions through time. And I think kind of in the spirit of what we've heard so much across the last few days is that indeed these scenarios can be boundary objects for looking at weaknesses in existing institutions and regulations where we oftentimes aren't necessarily pressure testing them when it comes to climate. It can think about kind of proactive creation of positive futures. And I think what's been fascinating in the insurance scenario process I've been part of right now is that when you imagine kind of wildly diverse possible futures, you actually start to see potential seeds of them in many ongoing experiences, which becomes a very different way of thinking about so what for what is happening right now and what we may want to monitor for into the future.
I would just add that I think the answer is yes as well. And there's 2 different ways that can happen, at least. One is if the scenario process has as its main goal simply the process itself, as opposed to the products that it produces. So you can imagine, well, do we want this process to produce a set of national scenarios that then the whole research community uses, right? That's focusing on the product. And that can serve as a boundary object, but in a different way than if you say, we're just going to have a bunch of workshops all around the country to think about futures for climate and society in the US. It doesn't really matter what we produce. What matters is the conversations that go on at the table in those workshops among the people that are there. And both of these are methods that are pursued, but they have as you can imagine, different implications for what comes out the other end, but also how you would go about organizing to do that in the first place.
And to be honest. I'll add to, to the extent that I understand what I'm looking at what a national socioeconomic scenario development process is. And this is part of the point, though. So I think it'd be super useful. To go back to my comments. So I have what might be viewed as my own work, it may be a highly stylized in many dimensions, although it's rich in many dimensions, may be very stylized in other ways. It'd be very interesting to get together with Bob and say, okay, if you show me, or we develop some, socioeconomic scenario, like what parts of that are missing from the economic model, and is it okay that they're missing, or is it not okay? And maybe we need to incorporate them. So I can see that as a way, as a focus to get discussion going. Yeah.
All right.
Oh, next, okay.
Thank you.
So the next one is, I think specifically addressed to Tony, but anyone can comment. About what are the big lessons from your interdisciplinary work as climate scientists in terms of building impactful interdisciplinary teams?
I guess that's for me. So, well, I think that the one big lesson is it took us a while to really get to the point where we could even talk to each other, I think. So I met, there was a conference at Yale many years ago when Trudy Sturelmo, who's now in Norway, was at Yale. She's a climate scientist we're working with, that brought together, actually somewhat like this, brought together economists and climate scientists. I think Ken Gillingham may have organized it at the School of Environment at Yale. So then it was, I presented my stuff. I got to meet, a bunch of climate scientists, including Trudy, and then you slowly start a conversation. Then we had lunch, and then, I'm doing this work, and you might be interested in this. So it took a long time for us to get to the point where we felt comfortable talking to each other, like trust each other, and then, and then just getting language. So they might say offline, or where we would say exogenous. They say online, and we get endogenous. So it's like, how do you translate? Well, offline, what does that mean? So apparently that's what it means. So I think somehow, events like this, I guess, that can get people talking and spark something or quite useful. I think that's probably the biggest lesson. I'll stop there. That's great.
Could I add one idea on this one as well?
Yeah.
So I think something for me that's been really interesting to watch, and I'd say this becomes even more important for transdisciplinary collaborations, not just interdisciplinary, is the degree to which federal funding at this point requires rigorous evaluation through and as part of the process of research. And what I mean by that is, I think if it's disciplinary research, interdisciplinary research narrowly defined, the traditional metrics of science work pretty well. IRB as traditionally defined works pretty well. But if you're really pushing into very co-produced or community-based research, being much more deliberate about understanding whether the process is working for everyone is just an increasing imperative. And the degree to which, what is the theory of change, the logic model for everyone coming together? How do you monitor outcomes towards longer term impacts? And how do you make sure that it's not just the scientist saying to NSF, it's going great, but instead, all of the knowledge holders and participants in that process?
I'll just add one thing. They're sort of connected, theories of change. Something I come from sort of the philanthropic and not-for-profit sector. So there's a lot of conversation about theories of change. And it's really easy in kind of networked environments to argue about whose theory of change is right. And what we've started to talk about is ecologies of theories or theories of transformation that transcend individual theories of change, because we know that actually we need them all, right? One philanthropy might say it's all about changing business practice, and another philanthropy might say it's all about grassroots activism. Both of those are valid theories of change that they might fund. The point is, where we've arrived at in human evolution is we need both of those theories. And so talking about ecologies of theories or theories of transformation, I think is really useful. Connected to that is also this idea of definitions. It's very easy to fall into what's your definition of a polycrisis? What's mine? What's your definition of a risk? What's mine? I really think we've got to the point where that's not actually very useful. I think the language and understanding is important. But we've started to very much talk about instead of definition, sensitizing concepts. And so trying to create a bit of space within the language of definition to open it up to say it's going to be very different depending on context and perspective. So just wanted to offer that.
Can I respond?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, not to this in particular, but comment on the previous two questions. I mean, I want to discuss a little bit this presentation of results, or this focus on result based on scenarios that are somehow fixed, and this has been particularly used, you know, in the science for the economic scenarios that then are incorporated into whatever predictions or analyses people do. And contrast that with the creation of these integrated assessment models in which, you know, everything is related and the progression of the economy affects climate and vice versa. And that's at the end of the day, the type of modeling that we are aiming to do, where there is not independent modules based on specific scenarios, but they are all linked in ways that are fundamental. And so that's where we hope to get to. And now, of course, particular scenarios can be useful in terms of benchmarks to compare what we're getting and, you know, see whether we are on the right track, etc. But ultimately, what we want is models that have the proper interactions so that we can use, as Tony was saying, use them for policy experiments to try to understand what's going to happen and how that's going to be, how it's going to be affected by different policies that we can put in place. And so I think part of the important part of the conversation is, for me as an economist, what type of input from scientists and in what format do I need it in order to effectively incorporate it in my research, and vice versa, right? And you as scientists and the scientists out there, what is it exactly that you need from me in order to incorporate this kind of feedback, so that eventually we're kind of closer together and we can build kind of a joint model where we can incorporate all these effects. But for now, even if we're kind of not quite there yet, it's very important for some of these outcomes to be in a way that they depend on certain characteristics, for example, of the economy that are useful for me to incorporate in my research, because otherwise we can talk a lot, but I cannot in a practical way incorporate some of these insights into this modeling. And so the question is, how do we get to that point where we can practically help each other in terms of our tasks?
Okay. So the next question is like big picture. I think there's funders here, so it will be good question for
One of them stepped out.
Let's wait.
yeah, that's right. So if we had $100 million to invest in this research agenda, what would you spend it on?
Give it a thought. Think for a moment. We're not holding you to it.
Yes. I think I already kind of said what I was thinking earlier. I think I'm impeded in my research by a lack of human resources and the right talent to put together these models. I think, as Esteban was saying, well, as we know, these models are large, they're complex. There's more complexity we'd like to add. They're hard to solve. I'm not quite sure how to solve them. Having teams of researchers who are up to speed on coding, modern coding, algorithms, dynamic economic modeling, as well as Earth system modeling, But at a very, at a down to earth level of writing code that will implement these dynamic processes and integrate them. I think that would be super valuable for me. And then I think the more data we can get on impacts at a fine degree of spatial resolution is just very, very important. And then you need teams of people to also analyze those data sets. So in economics, certainly teams of researchers are getting larger and larger. So there's more complexity, but I think for climate, we need even larger teams. 100 million is a lot. So I don't know if I spend 100 million there, but I could use part of it.
I'd spend it on 4 things. I'll just echo my colleague here. Sorry, forget your name.
Tony Smith.
I'll echo Tony's point about the modeling side of things, the assessment side of things. So I don't need to say much more about that. The second thing is on the response side, I think we have to have a much better handle on what do systemic responses look like. And I think that there is some indication of how to approach that at different levels. Really interesting local examples, subnational, national, international. But I think we really have to start to get our hands around those solution pathways, what those look like, and how we support those. Connected to that, thirdly, I'd spend money on communications and advocacy. I think we have to get much sharper about how we're informing others, how we're talking to decision makers, policymakers, and what that looks like, how we make the connections between those that are coming up with the research, the ideas, et cetera, and how we use that to greater influence. And number 4, I would invest in training of the next generation. We're muddling along, we're learning a lot. We have learned a lot, there's a lot more we can learn. And we really need to do that alongside sort of youth coming along that are going to inherit these really complex problems. And so how do we feed that into the university system in a better way? And how do we just really give them the tools that they're going to need as they move into an uncertain future? Do you want to spend $100 million?
Yeah, it's a hard question. But I'm going to answer it from my biased perspective as a modeler, and from the integrated assessment modeling perspective in particular. And by that, I don't mean the DICE type social cost of carbon modeling, but the larger scale sector specific, more detailed sort of process-based type modeling. And it sounds kind of basic, but there's still a long ways to go simply in these models having a wide range of climate change impacts that are simultaneously affecting society within the current standard modeling frameworks. So to be able to look at multiple impacts at the same time, one needs these kinds of larger scale integrative multi-sector frameworks. And we still typically have impact studies that are a study of agriculture or a study of water or of heat stress. But I think, maybe it's just for me, but I think it's a little bit more broad that these larger integrated modeling studies and analyses are pretty influential in shaping our picture, sort of big picture view of what the future may look like under climate change. And so it would be important to be able to bring these a diverse set of impacts into such modeling framework.
Yeah, so Esteban or Kate, do you want to add what's your 100 million wish list?
I'm not sure I have anything super clever to add. I think what comes to mind for me is, as we've been discussing the need for systemic approaches, transdisciplinary approaches, I also would just say it's important not to lose sight of the importance of basic research in this space also, and kind of thinking about how to get this whole ecosystem of science to coexist is really important.
I mean, I think the direction of the type of framework that we want is clear. We just need to invest in it. And in order to invest in it, we need people that are coordinated into the same type of goal in terms of what kind of model we want, what and how to bring the different expertise that is required in order to create that. And that kind of coordination effort that is going to require many types of expertise, etc., is, requires investment. But I think the first step in that is to kind of agree on what are the basic characteristics of that large model that we need to build in order to try to understand, at least the basic impact that this is gonna have on the economy. And I think one of the problems is that a lot of the efforts that are being done are very piecemeal and are not coordinated in terms of having certain characteristics that so that we can use and build from them in a coordinated way where we can incorporate the different types of pieces of research into some common knowledge. And so that coordination requires effort and resources, and it requires big research teams and schools and institutes, etc., that take a lead in coordinating that effort. So if you give me money, that's what I would do.
All right, thank you.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you, everyone. And can we thank our panel?